This is lecture 3. The title is Credit Unions. I already indicated the idea is that the word bank has become a bad word, and I'm envisaging a situation that after the collapse of the monetary system, nobody establishing a financial institution would want to call it a bank, because bank would be a bad word. People would have nothing to do with it. So looking around for alternative names, credit union came handy. So the first time when I lectured on this, I dedicated the lecture to the memory of Ely Moore, the first union official who was ever elected to the Congress. The year was 1834. He was a solid gold standard man, unusual for a union official, but remember that was in the 19th century. And Ely Moore believed with Daniel Webster that, and this is a quotation from Daniel Webster himself, of all the contrivances for cheating the laboring classes of mankind, none has been more effective than that which deludes them with paper money. I repeat, quotation is from Daniel Webster, and it was true then, and it is still true, I think. Charge has been made that the gold standard was conceived to protect the rich, and just the opposite is true. The gold standard is the protector of the laboring, because when it comes to capital, a laborer, a wage earner, if he ever sees capital firsthand, it would be a gold coin. He would not see capital, would not own, he would see it because he would be working with capital. These are the tools of production. But he would never own a serious piece of capital. But if he owns a gold coin, then he does it, and then he could become an employer later on himself. So we started out discussing real bills. They provide credits to move urgently demanded consumer goods from the producer to the retailer. We don't need banks for that. In any event, short-term commercial credit arises not through lending, but through clearing. I already mentioned that the way credit arises, credit represented by real bills, is through clearing. There is no lending involved. It would be wrong to say that the wholesaler is lending or making a loan to the retailer, because actually the retailer is closer to the consumer, so therefore it's he who calls the shot. So if you ask the question, who is the stronger partner in this business relationship, you would have to say the retailer. So this is just the opposite of people suggest that the wholesaler is lending or making a loan to the retailer, which the retailer repays at the end of the period. That's just complete nonsense. Whoever is closer to the ultimate consumer is handling a merchandise which has more dynamics, which is more liquid, more in demand and so on. So that's a complete distortion to suggest that this short-term credit represented by the bill involves lending. Credit, yes, but not lending. As the supply of consumer goods emerge in the production process, so does the means to finance its movement. And that's just the bill, the real bill. The maturing good moves in this direction from the original producer, usually agriculture or mining or whatever it is, getting closer and closer to the consumer. So that's the direction of the movement of the maturing consumer good. At the same time, the bill, which is financing the movement, is moving in the opposite direction, issued by the retailer on the strength of his customers, going to the wholesaler and the various other producers of semi-finished goods. So I repeat, no lending is involved. Coin, credit, circulation, clearing, the 4 C's I mentioned when I quoted Adams and added the word clearing myself. The 4 C's are central ideas and economics has by and large ignored them. And in the case when economists discuss them, like in the case of clearing, they completely misrepresented the idea. Clearing is extremely important, and to understand the movement of the maturing good and the movement of the clearing instrument in the other direction, because the credit does not involve lending. It's in the dynamics of the clearing system. Now, here is a mental experiment. Imagine that General Motors has come into the possession of a fantastic contrivance, a fantastic invention, an invisible vacuum cleaner capable of siphoning off money from the pockets of every worker. If the union made a gain of $2 for the worker, $1 would be siphoned up by this invisible vacuum cleaner. Further, imagine that the invisible vacuum cleaner would operate secretly and unobtrusively, just like other contrivances did in the recent account, at that time when I wrote this first, it was recent, the Enron and the scandal. What you might bring up the more recent instance of the subprime scandal and crisis, so that the theft or embezzlement could not be detected. What would be the result of the wholesale application of this device by General Motors? Well, labor would have to run twice as fast on the treadmill just to stay abreast. If of every $2 wage increase, $1 was taken back by General Motors through this invisible vacuum cleaner. Yet the union could pat itself on the shoulder for the wonderful job it did for its workers. It is doubtful, to say the least, that the existence of a contrivance like this could be kept in secret forever. Another problem with the scheme is that the tacit assumption that the workers and their unions is a bunch of illiterate boors unfamiliar with the four rules of arithmetic. Yet the parable, this imaginary story, is not quite as fanciful as it may appear at first sight. Actually, there is an invisible vacuum cleaner. It is called deliberate currency debasement. Just substitute government for General Motors, and the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle fall into place immediately. Unlike General Motors, the government cannot be sued for siphoning off labor's gains fraudulently and surreptitiously. The modus operandi, the way to operate the government's invisible vacuum cleaner, is known and condemned by many courageous critics, but to no avail. The media ignores the criticism, and the public's anger is not raised. Some monetary experts are blackmailed, and some economists are bribed with fat government contracts and grants. To add insult to injury, the funds used for bribing have come out of the loot itself. The chorus of servile economists suppresses the voice of the critics. To the former, deliberate currency debasement, which they prefer to call inflation, something God-given or nature-given, with a connotation that, far from being man-made, it is a natural phenomenon. It's merely a minor irritant. They say no moral dimension to the problem. As long as inflation is barely noticeable, everything is fine. Economists cheer on the government for its valiant efforts to combat inflation, as if it weren't this very same government that has been both the engineer and the beneficiary of what is being combated. The invisible vacuum cleaner can only be operated by the government, which is free to bend the legal system to its advantage. It can even violate its own constitution with impunity at pleasure. The Constitution of the United States expressly forbids the use of bills of credit, which could be the Federal Reserve note, for example, as legal tender, explicitly in the Constitution. But this has never inhibited the Treasury from printing the legend on every Federal Reserve note that it is legal tender for all obligations, public and private. Since the executive arm of the government controls the judiciary, certainly at least as far as the jurors' compensation, salary are concerned, no wonder that the latter, judiciary, condones the fraud of siphoning off labor's wage gains, and no legal challenge to the operation of the invisible vacuum cleaner can ever succeed. This brings to mind a quotation which is from Samuel Butler, who lived between 1600 and 1680. He wrote a book by the title Hudibras, rather old-fashioned by today's standard, but there is an eternal line, a jewel, which I quote, just a one-liner. Doubtless, the pleasure is as great of being cheated as to cheat. Which is amazing, because it fits this embezzlement of the gains of labor so perfectly. The government cheats. But if you look at it today, you might say those who are being cheated enjoy it immensely. And even cheered, and they accept the incredible charge that the gold standard is worse than what we have today, as a lot of labor organizations do. And I find it amazing that people like Ron Paul could not persuade labor leaders that just the opposite is the case. Not only does the government bribe the economist profession, it also uses its control over public education to throw dust into the eyes of every new generation of workers entering the labor force. Docile teachers fail to instruct their pupils about the importance of the virtue of thrift, about honesty in dealings between the government and its subjects, or between the government and its creditors. Instead, they preach the desirability, nay, the necessity for the government to manage the nation's money supply, which is just as absurd as the idea of the government managing the nation's soap supply. The citizens are immersed in a barrage of government propaganda from womb to tomb. Small wonder that the workers are confused and their unions are blinded to official duplicity and chicanery. The invisible vacuum cleaner reaches not only into the pockets and bank accounts of domestic workers, it is equally effective in siphoning off the savings of foreign workers. It is the Moloch, this ancient Hebrew god of the world, the Moloch of the world. The Moloch was famous of devouring his own children, and that's what the government is doing. It can reach into the vaults of central banks and the mattresses of poor peasants the world over, wherever dollar banknotes or balances are held. U.S. Treasury bonds in the hands of foreigners are, in effect, irredeemable promises. At maturity, the holder of one issue can only exchange it for another scrap of paper carrying another irredeemable promise. The promisor assumes no responsibility except for the quality of ink and paper to make counterfeiting harder. If at maturity the dollar is worth only a fraction of the value of the dollar with which the bond was purchased 30 years earlier, that's too bad. But it is entirely the problem of the foreign holder of the bond. Why, under these circumstances, are foreigners so foolish as to buy and hold U.S. Treasury securities? Here is the answer, courtesy of Samuel Butler. Doubtless the pleasure is as great of being cheated as to cheat. Foreign holders to beat their own central bank. They try. They are proud that they have outsmarted their homegrown looters, as the securities of their own governments lose value even faster than those of the U.S. I come to discussing the quantity theory of money, which is a false theory, it teaches that the value of money is a function of its quantity. If there is more money in circulation, it is worth less, and vice versa. And this is the argument which the monetarists put right in the center, and they claim, and of course the name of Milton Friedman again comes up first, they claim that the value of money can be controlled by controlling the rate of its issuance. You know, I mean, this is an incredible thing for a scientist to say, because the premise is that these instruments were promises and they were issued fraudulently. They are promising something which the issuer does not have the means nor the intention to fulfill. I mean, whatever the US Treasury has borrowed ever since Nixon, there's no way to make good on the promise to repay. They still talk about the full faith and credit of the United States, which is a joke, which is a very sad joke. Now, what Milton Friedman is saying in a sense is that if you limit the quantity of false promises, then they will become, they can keep their value indefinitely. As if people were stupid and incurably so. When Abe Lincoln already said that you cannot fool all the people all of the time. Yet Milton Friedman says, yes, you can. You just issue the false promises at a controlled rate, not more, say, as 3% a year. If you keep to this quantity rule, you'll be all right. You can fool all the people all of the time. The pleasure of being cheated. There you have it. So how could we account for the travesty that the government, while doing these things with impunity, earns high praise for combating inflation? The short answer to these difficult questions is the government has, over a period of time involving several generations, successfully indoctrinated people with a most dangerous and vicious doctrine, the quantity theory of money. It's a theory which is dressed up in scientific terms, especially borrowing heavily from physics. According to this theory, the value of money is determined not by its quality, but solely by its quantity. The obvious motivation of the quantity theory is the a priori removal of all moral considerations from the debate on debt-based money. A priori means that before any other discussion, you have to do this. You have to remove all possible moral considerations from the discussion. Since regulating the quantity of money involves regulating the banking system, it follows that the task can only be entrusted to the government. So says Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman does not admit that the private market could issue money. No, you need the government. Only the government can make the ponderous decisions impartially, which are involved in the problem of increasing the quantity of money in uniform doses, year in and year out. The quantity theory of money uses an impressive array of mathematics equations, such as the equation of exchange. I am not going to use the flip chart. I just say mv equals pq. M times v, this means the quantity of money times its v, velocity, is equal to p, a price, times q, the quantity. The purpose of the exercise, of the mathematical exercise, is to persuade the uninitiated that human action, just like mechanical action, can be reliably predicted via mathematical formulas. However, individuals are not molecules, and therefore the essence of human action cannot be captured by equation. And I say this as a mathematician, and I know what I'm talking about. There is human action, and then there is the action of molecules, atoms, and the physical entities without free will. And these are two different things. And one action can be described in terms of differential equations and other mathematical methods, but if free will is involved, then it's quite futile to say that the behavior of the molecules with free will subject to the same equations as molecules without free will. It's preposterous. Human individuals have what molecules do not, namely free will. You may plug in space, time, mass, force, etc. into the equations, but you can never, ever plug in free will, not into a mathematical equation. The trouble with the quantity theory of money is that it is palpably false. Monetarists have utterly failed to come up with a universally acceptable definition of money. This is evident from the proliferation of monetary aggregates such as M1, M2, M3, and so on, M99. I don't think they have reached that stage yet. Milton Friedman tried to get around the problem by talking about high-powered money. Now, what's high-powered money? According to his definition, and this is something he can obviously define, high-powered money is the deposit liabilities of the Federal Reserve banks, as distinct from Federal Reserve notes, because just as you make deposit in your own bank, banks can make deposits in a Federal Reserve banks, and the liability of the Federal Reserve Bank to this private bank, say, is by definition high-powered money. So Milton Friedman thinks he has solved the problem. But he didn't. Because whoever has seen high-powered money ever buying a loaf of bread or a quart of milk? I mean, just imagine money which never buys bread and money which never buys milk. This is not the definition of money. Milton Friedman did not succeed in showing that money can be defined. His definition is not the definition of money, it's the definition of a special relationship between two banks, that's all. Nice try, but it didn't work. If we cannot agree on what money is, then how can we expect to regulate its quantity? Monetary scientist Walter Spar had this to say about this question in 1954, and I quote, "Apparently no quantity theory of money which has so far been stated has any validity." And he has died in the meantime, very respected monetary scientist. "The evidence alone is sufficient to dispose of such an assumption, but for the lack of relationship between the supply of currency and the prevailing prices need to be understood." And that's how he disproves the quantity theory. Currency is a two-dimensional entity. One dimension is the supply, the quantity. But there is a second dimension, which is velocity. And often velocity, the rapidity with which the supply of currency is used, is a more important factor than is the supply of currency in affecting prices. And well, this is something you have to think a little bit about if you want to understand it thoroughly. Currency has two dimensions. Supply is only one, velocity is the other. But if you ask the question, what impacts prices more, the change of prices up or down, then you will find out that velocity sometimes overwhelms supply. And that's what happens in hyperinflation. The velocity is spinning at a formidable rate. So you try to control prices by controlling supply of money. This could be overruled by people into whose hands money has flown, because they can try to get rid of money very fast, and then the effect on prices, whatever quantity rule you want to put in effect, will be negated. So it could be objected that it is hardly fair to blame the government for the outcome of a scientific debate that has ended with the triumph of the quantity theory of money. This triumph, it is alleged, has come about through meticulous statistical research, not through crude government interference with scientific inquiry. Did it really? To adjudicate this issue, it will be necessary to examine how the competing doctrine of quality theory of money, or as it is also known, the real bills doctrine, has been dethroned and ostracized through the crudest interference in science by the strong arm of the government. The real bills doctrine, as we know, has the most impressive credentials. Adam Smith made it the cornerstone of his immortal book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. It has served as the scientific basis on which the monetary system of Germany, the German Reich, pre-World War I, was constructed after it adopted the gold standard in the 1870s. So what happened was the governments were on the right track. Even in Europe, Germany tried to organize its monetary system along quite acceptable lines. This is interesting that Germany adopted Adam Smith's theory. of the real bill doctrine. But that was the basis, and it was all due to World War I that the whole system collapsed. The real bills doctrine was overthrown in the United States between 1914 and 1968. It was done piecemeal, but not by a committee of scientists acting in the service of truth, but by the same government that had overthrown the Federal Reserve Act. The original Federal Reserve Act was not an all bad document. That's the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Now, you may be shocked to hear me to say something like this, but I try to be fair and give credit where credit is due. The original Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was basically basically an outgrowth of the real bills doctrine. The Federal Reserve System was envisaged to be a commercial paper system. The government debt was not recognized among the so-called eligible papers, which the Federal Reserve banks. This didn't mean that the Federal Reserve was prevented from holding government paper. No, they were allowed. But there was a penalty, which was called a Federal Reserve tax. If the amount of government paper, government bonds, notes, bills, exceeded a certain limit, then the Federal Reserve banks had to pay a penalty, and the Treasury was supposed to collect it. You see, and that idea that the thief was given power to collect the tax defeated the system. The Treasury had no interest in collecting a tax which it was in the Treasury's interest that the banks held.
Well, you know, Antal, maybe it was a canard.
Maybe it was.
Maybe these were not ignorant men who
That's
thought this
right.
thing up.
That's right.
They were brilliant. And they did it in the dark of night.
Yeah.
They knew they were going to face opposition. They went ahead back, and then later on, they amended it where they could put in government notes alongside real, real bills of exchange and money to form the basis of the reserve.
Absolutely.
And so
Absolutely. This is amazing. And even today, you hear a lot about open market operations of the Federal Reserve. In fact, it's the Open Market Committee of the Federal Reserve which makes the decision what to do, raise interest rates or lower them or what have you. And you know what? The open market operations were not authorized by the original Federal Reserve Act. So they were illegal. They were introduced underhandedly. And only after the damage was done did they bring in amendments amending the original act that would legalize them. And if you really dig into this story, it's the most incredible thing of chicanery and underhanded. So to assume that all this happened by accident is, you have to be naive.
You have to be one of them.
Now here's a piece I like. And I gave the title to that short paragraph, Human Action or Horse Action. You have to know that Ludwig von Mises, a great economist of the 20th century, has his greatest work on economics, and the title he gave to it is Human Action. The idea is what we have just touched upon, that the movement of molecules in the sense of physics is one thing, and the movement of human and interaction of human molecules is another. The first is described by the laws of causality, and this is a physical law. There is cause and there is effect, and if you want to predict the effect, you go back and analyze the causes. But the same principle just wouldn't work if your subject matter is human molecules, because they have free will, which physical molecules do not have. So the principle of cause and effect, causality, is not applicable to this. And out of this thought, Mises created the concept of human action. In this way, he explains economics, not based on cause and effect, but based, and there's a word for that. The word is, what's the word? Causality and...
Teleology.
Teleology, not theology, teleology. And thank you very much, Rudy. I have to rely on you when my memory slips. That's Greek, and the meaning is purpose, purposive action. This is something which molecules do not have. They don't act purposefully.
Antal,
human beings do.
the Federal Reserve is a teleological construct.
It
It's
is.
intent, and it's purposive, and it works, and by its fruit you shall know it. It is the indebting of society, of producers, and of savers to the benefit of bankers and government.
Okay.
Just by the system operating itself. Its intent is built into it.
All right, so on the one hand, I explained human action in terms of Mises. Mises, who created that combination of words, human action. And now here is the other word, horse action, and that, the credit goes to Milton Friedman. This is what Milton Friedman said in criticizing the Federal Reserve System, because he was critical. No, you can't just forget about that. Milton Friedman was a very vocal critique of the Federal Reserve. Here is what he said, almost literally. I don't have the verse and chapter quotation, but it could be looked up. With a little bit of work, I could find it, where he said it and when he said it. But he did certainly say this, Milton Friedman did, in criticizing the Federal Reserve System. He said that even a horse can run the Federal Reserve. All you have to do is to set up a threshing machine. In the old days, when they harvested wheat or any other grain, they used horses before the threshing machine and combines and so on. They had horses go round and round. And they were either stepping on the sheaves of wheat, or there was some mechanism which is neither here nor there, I don't remember. But I just want to remind you that there was a time when horses were used for threshing wheat. And all you had to do to make sure that a certain amount of wheat will be threshed and ready to put in bags is to make sure that the horse did the threshing at the same rate. And that's all the Federal Reserve has to do, to learn horse action and get the grain out of the sheaves, out of the... So the question is human action or horse action? The Relevance doctrine, as well as the Wealth of Nations of Adam Smith, were conceived by their author as merely one chapter in the more complete work on society. This work was to be written in the great tradition of Scottish moral philosophy. Remember, Adam Smith was not a professor of economics in Scotland, he was a professor of moral philosophy. That's what he was. That was his official title. And it was Glasgow University in Scotland. And it was his intention to make a comprehensive work on moral philosophy, of which one chapter would be the Wealth of Nations. It's just a small part of a much bigger concept, moral philosophy. By contrast, the theory of money, as it is presented today by the monetarists, is entirely devoid of any ethical considerations, and is completely divorced from moral philosophy. Just as Milton Friedman has described it, even a clever horse can be trained to tread out the new money supply at a steady pace at the treadmill, unquote. But honest money is not the result of horse action, is it? Or a mechanical process symbolized by the treadmill or the threshing machine. It is the outcome of human action. If you want to keep it honest, it's the people who should create money at the mint by taking their gold and exchange it for the coin of the realm. If it's dishonest, then it's the dishonest people at the Federal Reserve, as you just pointed out, Daryl. So honest money that the workers, widows, orphans, and other people of small means who need protection can fully trust comes about as a result of the market process, the natural process of production, producing goods and services in society, aiming at satisfying the most urgent and demonstrable needs of the consuming public. Now, I think this is just wonderful, to put side by side horse action and human action. One is the idea of Milton Friedman, horse action. That's all you need, the intelligence of a horse, and there you can have your central bank. Or the idea of Mises and Adam Smith and all the rest of upright economists and monetary scientists, that money comes into being through human action, not horse action, and not even mechanical action. You cannot just put a computer and program it and then it will spit out money as society, no matter how complicated the input could be. You put in all kinds of statistics, and no, it's human action. I can't improve on that, I'm sorry. Horse action and human action. So that is something for you to take home with you. Horse action, human action. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz wrote a monograph together in the 1960s called Monetary History of the United States from 1867 to 1960. They wrote that gold was nationalized in order to capture profits for the government that were to accrue later to all holders of gold after President Roosevelt has devalued the dollar from $20 to $35. In other words, $1 used to be 1/20th of an ounce of gold, and after the devaluation it was decreased to 1/35th ounce of a gold. When a fellow Democrat of the president, Senator Gore from Oklahoma, he was a blind man, a very great man who, in spite of his blindness, managed to study complicated monetary theory, and he did that as a politician. He believed that he cannot be a good politician unless he understands money. So he took the trouble instead of being blind. And as I say, both Gore, Senator Gore, and President Roosevelt were members of the same party, the Democratic Party. So at one point, the president called together these Democratic senators and explained his measures in 1933, how to deal with the economic crisis, and part of it was to recall the gold coins, which means in plain English confiscating because the people were paid paper money in exchange. So you might argue it was not confiscation, it was just changing one form of money on another. But what Roosevelt had in mind was that once he grabbed the gold, people's gold, he would write up its value. And people who own the gold originally can kiss goodbye to that higher value. They were given the paper money and they could do what they wanted with it, but the gold was in Roosevelt's hand. So, this was quite controversial at the time. So he asked the senators, this was Roosevelt sitting here, and the senators were standing around, well, what do you think? And of course they all said, well, we understand this was necessary. And so came to Gore, and Gore said something different. He said, Henry VIII of England approached total depravity as nearly as the imperfections of human nature would allow. But the vilest thing that Henry ever did was to debase the coin of the realm. He didn't comment on what Roosevelt did, but this was certainly even viler than the Henry VIII did, who was a totally depraved man, according to, in his opinion. Earlier, when President Roosevelt asked the same senator, Senator Gore of Oklahoma, for his opinion regarding these measures, he answered, "Why? That's just plain stealing, sir, isn't it?" Well, of course, He didn't endear himself to the president, and he would never win another election. I don't think he was even nominated. And this is all reported in Benjamin Anderson's Economics and the Public Welfare, a very great book on economics. Be that as it may, time has come to return to the looted gold. How would you address that problem? Well, I don't think I really want to go into this because there are more important things, but that problem is still outstanding. I mean, people who had to surrender the gold was confiscated, are long dead, and so it's not possible to compensate them. But there should be some kind of amends made. And that problem I do address, but I don't think this is really of so great an interest at this moment. And let's just go on. After all, we are talking about credit unions, and I haven't said very much about it, have I? So, I continue with the question of closed shop and right to work. Gold coin circulation is to be spontaneous and voluntary. No legal tender laws will force it, as those laws are presently necessary to force the circulation of irredeemable currency, the Federal Reserve notes in the United States. People will be free to continue using the dollar, irredeemable dollar, Federal Reserve notes, in exchange for their goods and services if they want. And they can also use it for the purposes of savings if they are they lack intelligence to that effect, because who in his right mind would use the dollar for the purposes of saving? But anyhow, there would be an alternative. The alternative would be gold coins of the realm, which they get from the mint if they take their gold and convert it into the coinage of the nation. The legal status of the Federal Reserve notes has to be withdrawn. Call the day M Day, M for mint, the day when the mint is open to gold and silver. That contracted before M Day could be retired either with paper dollars or with gold coins at the option of the debtor. As far as the debt contracted after M Day is concerned, provisions in the contract should apply. Labor organizations would ask their membership to decide whether they wanted their wages to be paid in gold eagle coins or in Federal Reserve notes. Let's see what the membership wants.
I can see. The professor negotiated the UAW.
Where labor is not organized, a committee with labor and management representatives, say 2 labor votes for every management vote, would make the same decision. This is a very delicate issue, and we must well understand that a great deal of educational effort is needed to make the labor force see the implications of what is involved. Those laborers who want to retain closed shop, fixed minimum wage rates, unemployment insurance benefits, and social security benefits, company pension, health, and other fringe benefits, as well as long-term collective agreements to fix wages, should opt for the irredeemable currency, should opt to get wages paid in terms of Federal Reserve notes. The downside for them is that the value of the dollar will continue to fluctuate in terms of gold, and if history is any guide, the dollar value of those benefits will probably decline, or may even disappear abruptly if, for example, the pension plan collapses for lack of funding, which in many cases does happen. Those laborers, however, who prefer right to work to close shop and who would prefer fully funded health insurance and pension benefits defined in gold units to unfunded government health insurance and pension schemes defined in terms of the irredeemable dollar, should opt for the gold eagle coins in which their wages will have to be paid. Gold wage rates may fluctuate, but in return, the threat of unemployment will be removed, and workers will be free to make their own provisions for health care and pensions. Payroll taxes on gold wages, such as social security levies, will not be authorized. Laborers who have originally opted for wages payable in irredeemable dollars will be given a chance to opt for wages payable in gold every time their labor contract comes up for renewal, or annually in the case of unorganized labor. Existing labor legislation to govern collective agreements in dollar terms would not apply to wages payable in gold eagles. However, new legislation should provide that gold wages should be at least 10% higher than comparable dollar wages calculated in the floating exchange. Well, I don't want to bore you with these various things, but as you see, there are lots of technical problems in deciding when the transition takes place. The common thread in all this is that the ultimate decision should be left for the individuals. There should be an option. There should be as little coercion as possible. Obviously, legislation is necessary to put an end to the coercive legal tender laws, for example. That's obvious. This is not negotiable. But every other aspect which comes up, there should be as much leeway for individual choices as possible. And here is a provision which is probably important, and that's the divorcing the mint from the treasury. As it is, and as it was set up originally, the mint is an arm of the treasury, which is like entrusting the chicken coop to the fox, and that was a mistake.
Not for the fox.
The mint should be entrusted directly or subordinated directly to Congress, especially House of Representatives, which is getting re-elected every other year. It's further understood that the regulation of the gold component of the nation's currency is not the task of the federal government or central bank created by the federal government. The power to regulate the amount of gold money in circulation is reserved by the Constitution for the people themselves. The symbol of this power is the United States Mint. Not just symbol, instrument as well. To give better effect to this constitutional provision, better than what was done in the past, is that the US Mint should be removed from the control of the US Treasury and the executive branch altogether, and placed under the sole authority of the legislative branch, specifically under the direction of the US House of Representatives. This is not only fitting, but it is also in line with the language and spirit of the Constitution, which places all money matters into the hands of the direct representatives of the people. It follows that a simple majority vote of the House of Representatives will suffice to originate this transfer. So this could be done today if there was the political will, because that's a money matter. So if they had any spines and any they should follow Ron Paul, and they should vote with a simple majority to remove the mint from the jurisdiction of the executive and take control. That could not be challenged. It could go all the way to the Supreme Court and would be approved. And the regulatory power over the credit unions must be retained also by the US House of Representatives without the interposition of the US Treasury. Well, with this I close that lecture, but we still have some time, so I'll be... Do we?
Yes.
Yeah. Any questions? Yes?
I have a question not from this lecture, but from earlier.
Okay.
When you were talking about the small change having a 10 or 15% seniorage on it. Am I?
That's the silver.
Right.
For coppers, nickels, it could be greater.
Right. Well, let's say for sake of argument, it's 15%. I want to make sure I understand the chain of causation here. Is it true that if the founding fathers in the 1792 Coin Act hadn't set the exchange between gold and silver at 15 to 1 or 16 to 1, whatever it was, if they hadn't done that, if they had gotten it exactly right and said, we'll just let the silver dollar be X amount, X many grains of silver, the Spanish mill dollar, and we'll let the gold eagle be whatever exchange ratio to silver that the market sees fit. If that had happened, would there have been a problem with, couldn't they have let all of the small change be full-bodied as well? Because there would have been no problem with people hoarding it, trying to gain the gold-silver ratio. Is that a true statement? Could they have had full-bodied coins at all sizes of coins, half dollar, quarter?
Yeah, I understand your question. My answer off the cuff is that they couldn't be full-bodied, because whether it's silver or it's gold, they would still disappear from circulation. What happened under bimetallism is that at one time silver disappeared from circulation, at another time gold disappeared from circulation. And this was always the more valuable metal which disappeared. That's the law of
Gresham's law.
Rudy? Gresham's, thank you. Gresham's law says that cheap money drives good money out of circulation. That's a crude way of putting it, but it's acceptable. And that's what happened. Now, if silver coinage and gold coinage had a variable relationship following the market ratio, Gresham's law wouldn't come into force, because Gresham's law is always a consequence of coercion or some coercive rule which makes it compulsory to accept or make two unequal equal. Okay. So true enough, this problem would be solved. But if subsidiary coinage was full-bodied, then I think it would still happen that subsidiary coins could be hoarded. And when would that happen? It would happen when
It would seem to me, it would happen when the value of the coinage as a metal was greater than what would be used in the monetary system. Don't you think they would disappear then?
yeah, but the full-bodied means that the two values
Don't conflict.
Well, what I'm wondering is maybe does it have to do with the fact that it would be, it's one thing to have the silver dollar issued free of seigniorage by the mint in unlimited amounts, but the government was trying to put some sort of cap on the expense of running the mint, and maybe that's why they could never have full-bodied small coins, because it would just be too great an expense, and they'd also be constantly replacing the wearing out dimes and quarters free of charge as well. It's just too much, and so maybe that's the reason why, even if the ratio between the two metals was not fixed, they still could not provide full-bodied coins. See, I'm trying to think how we might get back. What would happen if the mint was reopened to both coins, both metals? If they could provide any size coins other than just full-bodied ones. Maybe it's too technical, or maybe it's not really relevant to your arguments here.
I can see the reason why you asked this question, probably because even that limited legal tender requirement looks like an invalid invasion into the rights of the individual, maybe. Well, I don't know. I must say I would have to think about that.
Could I add 2 cents word? Yeah, I think it was impossible to have such small gold coins to be like a penny's worth. I mean, it would have to be a milligram of gold. It can't be a coin.
Right.
So they said, well, copper is worth a lot less per ounce, so we can take a significant chunk of copper and make that. So you're sort of obliged to set a value to it, or else there'll be too many floating values in the market. But in this day and age, there are such things as milligram embedded little tiny grain of gold in a plastic card. So maybe this whole copper, nickel stuff would go away, and it would be a tiny piece of gold, and then it would be full-bodied in that size, with maybe just the extra cost of encapsulating it, differentiating the two products. Because always, if you buy a half-ounce gold coin, the premium is a little bit higher, but it's more labor to make it, and the smaller it gets, the more relatively expensive it is.
Yeah, I guess I was just asking you to see whether the seigniorage rate was related to the fact that the ratio was fixed between gold and silver, but I think I'm misunderstanding the
Most people here are too young, they wouldn't remember, but when I was in Britain for the first time in my life, the copper, the 1 penny coin, and that's not the present decimal system they have, but the old system when 12 pennies made a shilling and so on. The copper was a big coin, probably as big as a silver dollar. And I remember if you wanted to make a phone call or a couple of phone calls, you had a problem. You had to, because that was still a couple pennies to make a phone call, local phone call in London, for example. And you just had to feed that heavy, big coins into the phone to get connection. And it was altogether inconvenient. Now, why was the copper so big? Because that's a throwback to the old thinking that even though you cannot have a full-bodied copper, but as Rudy is suggesting, the copper should have as little seigniorage as possible. And the only way to do that is beef it up until it's a big coin, so big that in effect it's inconvenient.
So maybe it was the phone companies that started the debasement. Coinage.
Well,
Out of convenience.
Wonderful excuse for the government.
Well, I mean, I don't see an issue in terms of the impinging on individual rights about legal tender for, 100, you have to accept 100 pennies.
Yeah.
But obviously it would be better if you can keep the seniority as low as possible within limits of reasonableness trying to run a mint, because I think it is right that the mint should be operated free of charge to people trying to convert them.
Yeah. But the short answer to your question is that, as Rudy pointed out, is that even if you do that, full-bodied silver subsidiary coins, they are still too big to serve, because sometimes you want to buy just a newspaper, an egg, or whatever, and then the coin would be so small, so you would have. So there is no real solution to the problem, but you have to accept that subsidiary coinage is all right, provided that people can go to the mint and use it for its original purpose, which is to create money on demand when people want it, not when the banks, but when the people want it, and that is that is the big function. And then there is a subsidiary function for the mint to provide the small coinage for commerce.
That's us.
That's us. Common people, wage earners.
I had another, if no one else has any questions, I had another clarification question.
Okay.
The idea of using the mint, I could bring a coin from another country that was known purity to the mint, or I could bring a bar that was 0.999 purity, but I couldn't bring my silverware to the mint, right? I couldn't bring or jewelry to the mint and say, melt this down, assay it, and give me gold coins, or would I be allowed to do that as well? Was that what the founders had envisioned?
This is a question?
Yes.
Of an open mint.
Yeah.
Would I think what Nathan's asking is that if you had a mint, an open mint, as
If the mint is open to gold or silver.
Does it include if he walked in with silverware? I mean, and said I have, or gold, would jewelry?
No. Free of seigniorage means that if the metal you present is the right weight and right fineness, then there's no charge, zero charge. They would give you silver for silver coin for silver, no charge. However, if the fineness is not certified, and if there is any assaying involved, then there will be an assay charge, which has to be distinguished from seigniorage. And you can take silverware if you want, but then there is a refining charge and an assay charge.
Yeah, that's only fair.
So that's fair. The open, if the mint is open to the free coinage of silver and gold, that strictly means that you have to surrender the right weight and right fineness, then there's no charge. In any other case, there might be an appropriate charge. That's how it worked, and that's why a lot of US mints were established in places where close to the mining regions. There is a mint in the South or North Carolina, I think. There were gold mines there. You can look around. I've been there and I've seen a disused gold mine there. And of course the California, San Francisco mint. And the idea is that it should be close enough where the gold or silver comes from, and as little cost and expense as possible involved in. These were marvelous provisions. It's amazing that they went out of their way to even avoid the impression that there is some monkey business or possible, or future bureaucrats or bankers or whoever would play dirty games on the people. But no matter how far they go, the crooks will find a way, and
they did.
And they do.
They did.
Well, if no other question, call it a day, and we'll meet again tomorrow, 10 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you.